Well, hello and welcome or welcome back to Read Becca. It's Tuesday, so it's time for a tag. Today I'm going to be doing La Bella Italia Tag. This tag was created by the Linguist's Library and Uncommon Reader, and I was tagged by Book Chat with Pat. So this tag I actually kind of struggled with, but for all the wrong reasons. The prompts are inspired by places in Italy, though you don't have to follow any sort of Italian influence in your selections. And many of these prompts are kind of general genre categories. So they were so broad, I really struggled to focus and narrow it down to a single thing, but I have managed that. So let's go through my very much narrowed down selections from a larger list. Because it is so broad, I did try to pick things that I maybe haven't talked about in a while. So number one is All Roads Lead to Rome, history or historical novels. And for that, the history that I want to point you to, that I will just keep pushing on people ever since I read it for the BookTube Prize, is Paradise Falls. This is a historical event that occurred in the US not that long ago, only a few decades ago, so this is not ancient history. And it reads like very gripping corporate espionage and true crime, because really we're having this hidden secret poisoning of a small community through toxic waste dumping practices. And what I love so much about this book is that it really centered the people who were struggling and fighting for themselves and their families and just how much resistance they faced. But it also shows both the positive and negative sides of government's role in that, and kind of the fact that you have to have government to get out of a situation like this. So I thought it was really, really fantastic. Number two, Wherefore Art Thou, Verona? Romance books or literary fiction with ill-fated lovers. And for this one, I had a very, very obvious selection. I feel like a huge amount of people will probably pick this, but this is Saga, Volume 1. And Saga is very much Romeo and Juliet in space. We have two lovebirds on opposite sides of warring factions. And it's such a beautiful and heartwarming story while also being tragic and heartbreaking. And it's not a romance, but it is a love story at its core. And it's so tragic because no one wants them to be together. And so they're set on the run continuously as this series has gone on, simply because they're from opposing sides, and for their love to exist is too threatening a message to this war and the powers that be. So I just love this series and can't wait for the next volume to come out of it. Next we have Florence, Brushstrokes and Botticelli, books about art and music or artists. So I went with the one and only fully art book that I have. It's a coffee table book, and that is Glory. The artists are Karen and Regis Bethencourt, and this is Magical Visions of Black Beauty. But what I love so much about this is that they actually, in the photos, they've interviewed their models, who are young people of color, and discussed their ideas of their future, their visions of what they want from their future, while also having this incredible costuming and photography. So incredible. So I just loved what they were doing with every step of this book, and that's why I own it, obviously. So next we have Sicily, Myths of Mount Etna, mythology, fantasy, and sci-fi book. So mythology, fantasy, and sci-fi. I went for an option that contains all three, and that is Senlin Ascends. This is such a really wonderful epic quartet, and I've read nothing like it, really. So this follows a school teacher, Senlin, as he and his wife are going on their honeymoon to the Tower of Babel. So this is the Books of Babel series. And the Tower of Babel is this insane, incredible place where every ring, every layer of the tower is basically its own quadrant, its own world with its own rules and social customs, its own technologies. Everything about every ring is completely different, and it's so creative and innovative. So they get there, and it is so big and massive that they immediately become separated. And so over the course of this, we're drawing from a lot of things that have mythological vibes, and we have the mythic Tower of Babel. It very definitely is kind of a Victorian-esque fantasy setting, with also some sort of steampunk technology elements that go into some sci-fi places, for sure. So it's really a mix of the three things, and I just love how creative and different this series is. Next we have the Bolognese Chronicles, food-themed books. So for that I have, this is not actually the first in series, this is Idle Ingredients by Matt Wallace, but this is one of the books, the only one I have in physical edition, from the Sin du Jour series by Matt Wallace. This is a series of novellas. Each of them has a name inspired by the 7 deadly sins, but this is a contemporary fantasy series that is following some chefs who have been hired by a quiet little catering company that caters to a paranormal clientele. So it is very, very food focused. Next we have from Sardinia with Love, thriller, adventure, spy, or heist books. This one I waffled so much on, but I'm going to give you Warlight. Warlight is not talked about that much. It definitely got some praise and even award buzz, but so few people talk about it or have read it here on BookTube that I've seen. And it's by a very heralded author, Michael Ondaatje, but it also has this wonderful mix of literary and accessible storytelling, because I found it to have this story where we're in 2 timelines. One where we have these 2 children whose parents are kind of shadowy figures in their lives and leave them with people who to them are strangers, who are kind of mysterious and unusual, who have odd names and are quirky but really loving characters to them. And then we follow their adulthood as they're looking back on that experience and what they experienced, whether that was really normal or whether their parents were spies. And so it has a great vibe to it that to me reads really similar to what it would look like if you took Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events and wrote it for adults. It really strongly felt like that to me. And so I kept getting this certain sense of whimsy and quirk to it. So next, let's go to Venice, in A Gondola with Casanova, Forbidden Love Affairs. So for that we have a much more romantic than saga. This is How You Lose the Time War. I would not really call this a romance novel, though it is saturated with a romance through the entirety and does technically fit the conventions. This is a very not hard science fiction story that is focused on 2 individuals, Red and Blue, as you can see here, who are on opposing sides of a time war, and they're time-traveling agents for the opposing sides. And over time, as they've been traveling through the same timelines and crossing paths, they start leaving messages for one another in very unusual places, in unreal places very often. Things like having a message grown into the rings of a tree, things like that. So this is much more prose focused and conceptual than it is really a straightforward narrative story. And it is quite short. So it's all about the beauty and concepts that you're reading, but I absolutely adore this and have read it multiple times. Next we have Naples Never Sleeps, mystery, horror, or gothic books. Again, this was a hard one, but I went for one that fits all 3 of those, mystery, horror, and gothic, and that's Things in Jars by Just Kid. So this is wonderful because we have kind of, it's historically set in kind of a Victorian period, I would say, around the time that kind of butchering arts and grave robbing are big aspects of this. And we're following a lady detective, which is great, and her ghost sidekick, who is also quite funny. So the tone of this is very different from what you would expect going in from this just beautiful cover, and this has been kind of heralded in literary circles. It's quite dark. They're investigating the case of a missing girl, and that leads them into some certainly paranormal things, though obviously we've got a ghost sidekick, so we know there's paranormal stuff going on. And just general gritty practices of the time. So it's dark and funny. It's got so many different genre blends mixed up into one thing that this was absolute catnip for me. And I really need to get to some more Just Kid for sure. I had to pause for a minute there, and now the light has almost all escaped from the room. So we're gonna have to rush through these last couple prompts before it all has left us. So number 9 is Tales of Terina La Magica, ghost stories, legends, novellas, short stories, plays, and folklore. So I leaned into the folkloric and legendary aspects of that and went for Deathless by Catherine M. Valenti. So I think most people on BookTube have heard of Winter Night Trilogy by Catherine Arden, and Deathless is the same story. It's very Eastern European, wintry setting, historical, around the war and very centering the mythos of Koschei the Deathless. And for some reason, this hasn't quite gained the popularity that Winter Night has. It similarly is very richly written and atmospheric, but I think that Valenti is kind of more of an acquired taste as an author maybe, and that's why, because her prose is super lush and poetic, while also being a little challenging for the reader. Like, I know I read her prose much slower than average, but it is so beautiful in terms of the prose. She also leans into the absurd and goes, like, not necessarily absurdist humor, but just taking things over the top as practice. And I enjoy that personally, but again, not for everyone. So onward to the final prompt, we have Musings in Milan, any genre, and bonus postcards from Italy, a book set in Italy. So mashing those together. I picked out a book that's not entirely set in Italy, but has a major Italy set scene, I would say, a prominent moment there. And that is A Certain Hunger by Chelsea Summers. This book is so great and so weird because it is a contemporary set story following a woman who is a food writer, like a big name food writer who travels all over the world. And she's also a serial killer who somewhat cannibalizes her victims. And we watch the story go along from before even the first time she does this. And it's so beautifully written, and her love of food runs through, but then juxtaposed up against her actual murders and cannibalism. And seeing both of those things through the same lens, through the same eyes that are able to sort of richly describe things, is really incredible, but also very, very unsettling. And so I think what was done specifically with the Italy scene is something that's very much stuck in my mind, because it really is a commentary on food and the way that societal views on food exist. And so, without spoiling anything, I think it just is really, really poignant in what it's doing, while also being very salacious and engaging as like a serial killer story. So I very much enjoyed that book, and haven't seen enough people talking about it on BookTube. So I think with that, we're down to tagging others. So I think I'm going to go ahead and tag Allie from Genteel Black Hole, and I'm going to tag Tiffany from Towering TBR. So that is it for me for the Bella Italia tag. Thank you so very much for watching.